Obviously, you're here to learn a bit more about the Sydney market and what's going on at the moment, so we'll jump right into it. If we have a look across the country, you can see that Sydney's actually been the best performer over the last 12 months with property values increasing by 0.3%. Now, to put that in context, though, inflation's running at about 3.6% over the 12 months to June, and we'll get new data later this week. But given that, all capital cities are seeing their property values become more affordable over the last 12 months. You can see across the combined capital city, values are down by 3.2%, so Sydney's doing much better than that. And then you can see at the other end of the spectrum, you see Perth with values down by 7.1%, Brisbane down 6.1%. They're doing much worse. So when you hear about the broad trends of the market, it's quite important in Australia to look more at a micro level than just looking at that macro level, because the performance of individual markets can be quite different, as you can see up here. And if you have a look at Perth, for example, values in Perth are down about 8.5% from their peak. Similarly in Brisbane as well, values are down about 8.5% from their peak. And as you well know, for a long time there was no growth in Sydney property values at all. So we've seen a bit of a catch-up over recent years. And actually, if you adjusted for inflation, Sydney property values and their growth in recent years, in real terms, property values in Sydney are still more affordable now than they were back in 2004, in the peak after the boom of the early part of this decade. If we have a look across all the capital cities and have a look at what's happened over the last 5 years, I guess that provides a little bit more clarity about how the market's been performing. 5% annual growth across the combined capital cities. You can see that Melbourne and Darwin have performed very well, comparatively speaking, 9.1% and 8.1% growth. And you see Sydney down there, 4.2%. Interestingly, four of the capital cities have actually seen growth of less than 5% over the last 5 years. That's average annual growth. And you can see Perth, values have basically gone nowhere over the last 5 years. If you took that back 10 years, 6.6% average annual growth. So you can see that the first 5 years of the last decade were a much stronger period for the housing market than the more recent times has been. If we have a look across the combined capital cities in terms of capital gains, obviously 2000 to 2004, very strong period for the property market. We all know the housing boom was going on, lots of activity across all areas of the country. And then affordability issues became very prevalent in the market, and we saw values starting to slide. So on an annual basis, you can see for about a year and a half there, property values across all capital cities went nowhere. And then in 06, 07, we started to see a ramp up, and in 07, value growth peaked at about 12% across the combined capital cities, but Sydney really didn't reap any of those benefits. In fact, Sydney values didn't go anywhere for 5.5 years, but we saw it particularly in Brisbane, Melbourne, Adelaide to a lesser degree as well. We saw very strong growth over that time. Then the global financial crisis came. Across the combined capital cities, we saw values fall by about 3.8% from their peak to trough. They peaked in February 2008. They reached their low point in December 2008. And then the Reserve Bank cut interest rates to almost their lowest level in 50 years. We also saw the introduction of the first homeowners grant boost, and we saw a kickback up in activity. Now, in October 2009, the Reserve Bank first lifted interest rates from that emergency rate setting. And basically from that point onwards, we saw that all the lead indicators started to slow. The rate of capital growth started to slow in the market. The level of discounting in the market started to increase. The time it took to sell a property started to increase. The number of listings on the market started to increase. So what that suggests to us is a lot of people that got into the market and a lot of the activity was expecting interest rates to remain lower for a lot longer than they did. And as soon as they started to be lifted, we saw a pullback in activity. And then now, obviously, we've had that peak, and then over the last year, values are down by 3.2%.